Beneath the light of the moon, they are said to gather, their cackling heard in the dense woods of forgotten wilderness, as reclusive crones and farmers' wives alike emerge to dance in the pale reflection of Hecate. Those who relish in the anguish of others, who mutter curses with rotten breath, whose rituals bring only misery, both to the living and to the dead. Be wary, as the witch is always longing for her next victim, and she could be anyone from the shadow hiding in alleyways to your very own neighbor. You best keep yourself hidden from her depraved gaze, because where her attention goes, ill intent follows. Witches have become one of the most iconic figures from history and folklore. They are now symbolic of the horror genre and the culture around Halloween. They range from disgusting old hags to the exact opposite. They can be vile, devoid of any human decency, committing acts only described as abhorrent. Or they could be innocent but curious teenagers. This wildly drastic spectrum that modern-day witches find themselves a part of is no doubt tied to their sheer popularity. And while they may have seen an explosion in pop culture in recent times, the idea of witches has long fascinated humankind. I don't need to tell you about the Salem witch trials, nor the numerous trials that took place across North America and Europe. Historically, witches and witchcraft are seen as a tragedy of justice, misunderstood people, innocent people having their lives ended prematurely based on false accusations as a result of witch trials and witch hunts that have more to do with fear than logic. We often talk about such trials involving witches as innocent people, often women, who were falsely accused, tortured to admission, and unjustly executed. Unfortunately, that was quite often the case, and it is a blood-red stain on the documented history of humanity. But what about the real witches? People who actively tried to practice witchcraft, and even those who did commit horrific deeds for a dark purpose. Of course, magic and witchcraft is not real in its power, but that doesn't mean intentions and practice are not. Well, this curious thought is what led me to this video. What are some real witches from history? While the idea of witches is mostly a modern creation, the term can be broadly applied throughout history. People who were outcasts that differ from the norm of society, reclusive but in touch with nature and magic. Sometimes evil, sometimes misunderstood, but usually possessing some uncanny, almost supernatural knowledge, or at least that's what they believed. Such cases are much rarer to find than the more numerous sham trials, but they do exist. However, as you're soon to find out, the line between the two is very muddied, making this topic a truly complicated one. Still, with sorcery and magic existing since the beginning of human history, there are many instances worth discussion. So what I have for you today is 3 periods where sorcery and magic gripped societies with fear. 3 periods of real witches and witchcraft. Please enjoy. Many islands make up the land of Scotland, giving it its unique geography, one such being the Isle of Bute. You'd be forgiven for thinking very little about this remote and sparsely populated island. However, it lays claim to one of Scotland's most infamous witch trials. In 1662, a group of women would become immortalized as the Bute Witches. This case started in the way many of these do, with neighborly disputes. Margaret McWilliam would be accused of witchcraft by her neighbor John McPhee after an altercation. This altercation, described by McPhee, actually was between McWilliam and McPhee's father and brother. They were attempting to travel with several horse loads worth of supplies, but had to pass through a field belonging to McWilliam. She had blocked the entrance with stones and had been lying on top of it. The father and brother attempted to remove the stones to pass through, and the father got into a physical fight with her. She then tried to lead the horse in the other direction, but was unable to, and the father would lead the horse over the boundary that McWilliam had guarded. The horse would suddenly collapse when it passed over. However, that would not be the end of it. McPhee himself would soon fall ill for months, in what he described as unnatural. He said he experienced pains similar to that of childbirth. One of his children would also suddenly fall ill as well and would suspiciously die within hours of becoming sick. McPhee would accuse McWilliam of cursing him, causing all of his recent misfortune. Now, this wouldn't be the first time McWilliam would be accused of being a witch. She had a reputation within the community and had been known as a witch for the past 30 years, being accused and imprisoned but ultimately let go 3 times prior. The first such time, 1631, there were some witches imprisoned in the dungeon of the nearby castle. These witches, that would be left to starve to death, claimed that McWilliam was also a witch. However, it seems nothing came of this. Over a decade later, in 1645, McWilliam would once again be accused of witchcraft. She was investigated, but the investigation found insufficient evidence against her and she would be released. Then again in 1649, she would once again find herself being investigated. This time, she would be searched for the Devil's Mark. Now, the Devil's Mark, or Witch's Mark, was said to be a branding of sorts, the devil marking those that served him. Quite often, accused witches would be searched for this brand, or claw marks made by the devil himself. Being found with this could be one of the most damning pieces of evidence against the accused. When McWilliam was searched for the Devil's Mark, it would actually be found in multiple places on her body. Now, apparently due to what's described as the confusion of the times, she would catch a break and be let go, escaping what would usually be a condemnation of witchcraft. However, she would not be so lucky in 1662 when her neighbor McPhee would bring charges against her. McWilliam did not deny her history of witchcraft. She tells of her chilling meeting with the devil. Some 28 years earlier, during a troubling part of her life, McWilliam would encounter the devil for the first time. He appeared as a little brown dog in a field by her house. He asked if she would follow him, but she refused. So instead, he followed her. He now appeared as a young man and asked if she would go with him, and in return, she would want for nothing. He then painfully gripped her thigh before disappearing into a green smoke. A bit later, he would appear in her field again, this time as a cat, once more asking for her to join him. This time, McWilliam would accept and entered into a pact with the devil, a covenant, becoming his servant. She renounced her baptism, in turn being rebaptized by the devil, who then placed his mouth on the wound he had previously inflicted on her thigh, alleviating the pain. She would then sacrifice to him a hen or a rooster. However, the devil would later appear to her a third time. This time she was in much peril. The recent death of her horse and being stricken with extreme poverty left McWilliam in a desperate state. The devil would tell her not to fear, as she would soon have wealth enough. This would not come without cost though. The devil required a great sacrifice for his aid. He desired her 7-year-old son, William. He gave McWilliam an elf arrow, which she would shoot him with, killing him instantly. Now all this was taken from her testimony. However, it's likely that it was altered to fit the narrative of her being a witch. Margaret McWilliam was perhaps alluding to the folkloric belief of fairies, something that we'll be coming back to. Put under a great deal of pressure during her questioning, she told tales of her encounters with fairies, which were known to broker deals that often included a drastic price. The fairies claimed her son, who was taken to the realm of fairies. An elf arrow would also coincide with that of traditional fairy beliefs. However, the trial would twist this into a child sacrifice and a pact with the devil. Now, it's unclear why she said what she said and to what extent she believed it. As for the death of her son William, it's unknown how exactly he met his fate. Did McWilliam blame herself for his untimely death? Had she actually killed him and used this story as a means to cover up or explain her horrific deed? Did she actually sacrifice him to some supernatural entity? Or did years of accusations by the community weigh her down to the point where she believed she was evil, being the very thing everyone thought she was and wanted her to be? We'll likely never know to what extent of her testimony was true, or even what she believed of it. Still, witchcraft was something Margaret McWilliam could not escape, nor her family. Her daughters would also be investigated as witches. It had been linked to much mayhem in the community. Catherine and Elspeth Moore, along with their mother and fellow witches in Bute, would be accused of placing curses and spells on people, bringing sickness, death, and misfortune to those who they found themselves at odds with. Many neighborly quarrels would result in accusations against McWilliam and her daughters. Alleged occurrences such as cows ceasing to produce milk, instead only blood in its place, and in other cases causing the death of livestock, thievery of others' possessions, disagreements over land that led to a curse that gave a woman a painful 20 days of labor during the delivery of her baby, even breaking into homes, placing dead cats, enacting spells causing sickness and death, even killing another young boy with an elf arrow. Basically, anything negative that would happen would all become suspicions against the odd neighboring family, blaming McWilliam and her daughters for all their misfortune. How much of the hatred of them was of their undoing or just scapegoating is unclear, but hysteria of these witches was common throughout the community. It seems just about everyone had a story to tell of the trio, and they infiltrated the thoughts and dreams of many of their fearful neighbors. One rather odd accusation came from a recent mother and was levied against the daughter Catherine. The mother had dreamed of Catherine, who violently attacked her, biting into and biting off part of her breast. When she awoke, she found that her breast was blue and no longer produced milk. She would beg to Catherine, and magically, days later, she would return to normal. The community indirectly gave the family power over them. Being well-known witches in the community, several accusations showed that they were feared as much as they were hated, being confronted in several instances, being threatened to remove their plight against them, but also sometimes being pleaded with, begged to do so. Often, what was ailing the person would be gone within days. However, it's likely that was either just natural occurrences going away with time, or the afflicted believing the spell lifted, tricking their own mind. However, if any of this is to have some credibility, it does seem that McWilliam and her daughters may have believed that they held some level of power, with supernatural influence over their community. Although this would seem to have been provided to them through fairies, not the devil. In one of the more drastic stories, the power that was believed to be held by the witches is on display. When one of the townsmen, McNeven, confronts Catherine about a debt she owed him, McWilliam is said to have cursed him in her defense. He would return home only to fall ill. 3 days of agony later, his wife Agnes would plead with and ask McWilliam to visit McNeven and remove the curse. McWilliam, admitting it was her doing in response to the threats against her daughter, told Agnes, in perhaps a show of mercy or pity, that she would return home to a healthy husband, which is exactly what happened. Still, a couple years later, McNeven would be involved in an altercation in the McWilliam house once more, somehow resulting in the mother and daughter tying him to a post. He would be released by her grandson, who himself was also accused of witchcraft, only to return home and have the same curse befall him once more. Agnes would once again beg McWilliam to lift the spell, but this time, instead of being met with mercy, she was met with the words, "Devil, let him never be seen till I see him, and the devil, let him never rise." Now, as mentioned before, Margaret McWilliam would not be the only woman accused of witchcraft during this infamous trial in Bute. Another woman, Janet Morrison, also had a long history within the community. She was a charmer, or a healer, who would lend her services to those who had been attacked by fairies. Her aid would often be accepted and she wouldn't be seen as a witch for some time, although the practice of being a charmer wasn't always seen in the most favorable light. Many believed that for her healing powers to be effective, she had to channel power from God, as he was the only one capable of such a divine gift. However, as belief in fairies evolved into that of demonic entities, Morrison's power was no longer perceived to be from God, but rather the only being capable of such strength, the devil. Morrison later recounted her strange meetings with the devil, who appeared to her as a black, rough, fierce man. He would promise her a better life, to lift her from poverty, and she agreed. Later, during one night, she would awaken to find a man named Adam Kerr at her window. Kerr, however, was supposed to be dead. He was actually said to be a victim of McWilliam and her daughter Catherine. Morrison would tell of the Sabbath that the local witches would frequent, where great numbers of witches would gather as the devil appeared to them. These covens would meet in various locations with alarmingly high numbers, being described in one Sabbath as a great army. With so many witches emerging from the shadows, hidden within plain sight of the community, this likely unsettled the investigators. Still, the line between fairies and the devil was blurred and skewed. Morrison, by all accounts, had been a healer, an expert in fairy attacks, whether it be from a fairy blast, which could be healed with herbs, or elf shot, which was incurable. Elf shot, or elf arrows, being a dangerous weapon made by fairies that could cause sudden death. According to her testimony, she had refused to use this elf shot to kill several people, going against the wishes of her master, the devil himself. Morrison's story is much more focused on the folkloric aspect of fairies, rather than the devil. When a local boy lost his life, one that suffered from a fairy blast that Morrison attempted to heal, she would blame not herself nor the devil, but fairies that had caused the tragedy. Many of these sudden and untimely illnesses and deaths were traditionally seen as fairy attacks, an idea that Morrison steadfastly held onto, that fairies, not her, were responsible for this misfortune. Still, she did accuse other witches of such acts, one being Margaret McWilliam and her daughters, who she claimed used elf shot to kill 2 men, one being the aforementioned Adam Kerr. One man would testify against Morrison in court, claiming that his wife had an altercation with Morrison. Apparently, she had underpaid Morrison, who then told her she would regret it. Later, she would be attacked in her house as everything went dark. Another woman testified, saying that she had seen Morrison in her dreams and awakened in fright to find her son ill. She would ask Morrison to heal him, but she said that he was shot twice by elf arrows and could not be healed. He would later die. It's unclear if the woman blamed Morrison for the death or if the dream had been a premonition of sorts. Morrison seemed to have had her place within the community as a successful healer, one not evil, but rather being in touch with the spiritual world of fairies. She was a victim to the passage of time, with the old ways becoming misinterpreted to that of evil. On the other hand, McWilliam never seemed to fit within society, being hated and often having disputes with her neighbors. All the same though, both of these women found themselves facing charges of witchcraft. Along with other local women accused of being witches, Margaret McLeaven, Janet McNichol, and Isabel McNichol would of course all be found guilty, most likely being executed in the manner popular at the time, being strangled then burned at the stake, although this is never explicitly said in the records. One woman, Janet McNichol, would actually escape and live free for over a decade until she was finally captured and then her execution carried out. On the surface, the confessions seem to have come willingly. However, it should be stated that the threat of not doing so would likely result in severe punishment such as torture and starvation. In the case of Morrison, she told the investigators what they wanted to hear, even if not true. She gave the secrets to her healing, her meetings with the devil, and the names of other witches. However, being rather intelligent, she was careful of what she said. Being aware that her words would be twisted and altered into what the trial desired, she would often switch between her native Gaelic and the investigator's English, such as when she recounted the story of meeting with the devil. When she asked what his name was, he replied, "Claire Enough," meaning clear enough as to who he is. Interestingly, the scribes who recorded the confession wrote this as meaning the devil, although she never explicitly said so. She was also careful to maintain her innocence of wrongdoing such as accusations of murder and inflicting ailments and curses. She was a healer, not a killer. As for McWilliam, she was labeled a witch her entire life by the community. How much of this was of her own doing and how much of it was just her neighbors scapegoating and shutting the odd woman down the street is unclear. With the muddiness of the investigations and confessions, it's impossible to tell myth from reality. To what extent were the accusations true? Obviously, the accused witches were not capable of the supernatural harm that they were found guilty of. But what did the women themselves believe they were capable of, and what was their intentions? Were they dark and malicious, doing the bidding of fairies and the devil? Or harmless, misunderstood, and morphed to fit a local narrative and nationwide agenda? Cases such as that of the Bute witches were not uncommon in Scotland. They were actually a small part of an investigation of a much greater scale. Throughout the 16th and the 17th centuries, Scotland would see several great Scottish witch hunts. Beginning with the hunt of 1590 and 1591, the country would be extensively searched for witches. There would be 5 of these hunts, occurring periodically throughout the next 70 years. The witch hunt of 1661 to 1662 would be the last and most severe of these extensive searches, though not the last of witch trials by any means. While during this period over 600 would see themselves accused of sorcery and witchcraft, there is one case that has puzzled historians. Isabel Gowdy was the wife of a cotter, a Scottish term for a farmer. Very little is known about her early life, but she likely led a humble life in the Scottish region of Aldern. An illiterate woman, Gowdy probably spent her days tending to the farm and completing household chores. No one would have predicted that this relatively obscure peasant woman would become perhaps Scotland's most famous witch. No region was safe from the witch hunts. From the highlands to the lowlands, the Scottish landscape was combed for possible witches, and Aldern was no exception. It's unknown why exactly she was accused and tried for witchcraft, but it seems she would be taken into custody from her countryside home near Loch Loy. Her husband would have no documented interactions with the trial. While little is known about Gowdy's personal life, her very detailed confessions are what has made her case such a curious one. The odd thing is, her confessions seem to have been given willingly. The records indicate that she was not tortured or intimidated into telling the stories that she does, which is something very unusual for witch trials that often saw the threat and even use of harsh torture to shape the confession to fit the desired narrative. It seems Gowdy was not coaxed into her confession, nor her words altered. Over a period of 6 weeks, while being held in solitary confinement, Gowdy would make 4 confessions during her interrogations. Like many of these stories, she first encountered the devil while walking outside. He convinced her to meet him at night. Now, for some reason, the Scottish devil liked for his covens to convene in churches, and that's exactly what Gowdy did, going to the local church at night. There, she was surprised to see many familiar faces. However, the most notable attendee there was standing at the podium. Reading from a black book was the devil himself. Gowdy would be welcomed into the coven. She renounced her baptism and placed one hand atop her head and one hand beneath her foot, devoted everything in between to the dark vestige before her. She would now be rebaptized by her new master, who placed his mark on her shoulder, from which he would suck out and spew blood onto his hands. The ritual was complete when he dripped her own blood over her and renamed her Janet. Later, the devil would meet her alone to finish her initiation. There he is described as a mickle, rough black man with forked, cloven feet. It's hinted that she had a sexual relationship with him. Later, her interactions with the devil were more explicitly said in a more graphic manner. If you're wondering what her husband thought about all this, a spell would actually keep him asleep during her nightly activities. She would place a stool or a broom next to him in bed, saying a spell and keeping him in a deep slumber. The coven, which was said to be one of many and had an in-depth hierarchical structure, would meet at night. The meetings, which included both men and women, where the devil would treat his subjects quite harshly as he delighted in beating them. Gowdy describes the secret of mischief they would get into. They would travel through the air by placing straw or a beanstalk between their feet and speaking aloud a phrase, allowing them to fly through the sky. They would sneak into homes at night and eat the best meats and consume the best drinks. Often the devil himself would join them for their feasts. They would say grace before, "We eat this meat in the devil's name, with sorrow and psyche and mickle shame. We shall destroy house and hold, both sheep and neat and still the fold. Little good shall come to the fore, of all the rest of this little store." Another notable power that the witches could achieve through repeating a phrase 3 times was the transformation into animals. The witches could shapeshift into any animal of their desire, except those deemed innocent, such as doves and lambs. Usually a cat or a hare was the choice. Gowdy herself often traveled as a hare, describing one task the devil sent her on where she was chased by dogs, stating that witches could not be killed in their animal form, however their wounds and scars carried over back to their human form. Similar to the Bute witches, the influence of fairies is prevalent in Gowdy's confessions. Interestingly, these sections are often ended short and prematurely by the scribes. Still, fairies and their magic are referenced quite a lot by Gowdy and show the overlap of the folkloric tradition of fairies in Scotland with that of the devil and his evil influence. Gowdy describes dancing with the coven in various locations inhabited by fairies. Perhaps most notably, she describes meeting the Queen of Fairies, also known as the Queen of Elfham. This queen is a very notable figure in Scottish folklore, who ruled over the home of elves and fairies. She would visit her home in the Downey Hills, where there was a large room where there was perpetual daylight. Described by Gowdy as handsome and clothed in white linen, the Queen of Fairies provided her and her coven with more food than they could possibly eat. Inside the queen's home, she would be frightened by elf bulls or water bulls, a traditional Scottish myth resembling an aquatic beastly creature. Once again, elves and fairies are described and seen as magical and malevolent creatures, while John Morrison described the damage and lethality of elf shot and elf arrows. Isabel Gowdy tells of their production. In the caverns of the aforementioned Downey Hills, these arrows would be crafted by elf boys, small, humpback creatures. The devil himself shaped the arrows, and upon the elf boys sharpening and completing them, the devil would give them to his witches to carry out his dark tasks. The witches would be asked to kill people with these arrowheads, which were not fired from bows but rather flicked at their target. Just as Morrison had said being hit with an elf arrow meant certain death, Gowdy tells of their potency. The arrowheads need only touch their target to ensure death, with not even armor being able to save the victim, reciting lines that roughly translate into modern words as, "I shoot this man in the devil's name, he that shall not go home, and this shall all be so true, there shall not be one bit of him alive." Gowdy claims to have killed many people in this simple but effective way. However, elf arrows were not the only tool at a witch's disposal. She gives recipes for poisonous concoctions and recites spells that could curse an unfortunate soul. While it seems that the witches killed often at the demands of the devil, they also committed lesser crimes such as interfering in the production of crops and livestock. One way that this could be accomplished was by performing a morally twisted ritual. The remains of an unchristian dead boy would be exhumed and in combination of other ingredients such as fingernails and leaves would form a putrid concoction. This would be poured over the fields, destroying the harvest and giving the farmer only straw to reap. One of the more evil deeds described in the Confessions is how the coven would murder children, specifically the boys of the Laird of Park. This would be accomplished by creating clay effigies of the boys and destroying them. Their torment of this man would not be a one-time occurrence either. Whenever he had another son, the witches would repeat the process after the boy reached 6 months old, ensuring that the Laird of Park would never have a male heir. While the witches held tremendous power, especially when aided by other witches as well as the devil himself, once they were incarcerated, their powers were said to be no more. After being imprisoned and interrogated, Gowdy would give the names of those she claimed to have killed, even expressing some remorse for doing so. She would also give the names of her fellow witches within her coven, condemning them to a bleak fate. Around 41 people would be arrested due to her and her fellow witch Janet Breadhead's allegations. While the records don't explicitly tell of her ultimate fate, it's agreed by most historians that she likely met the fate of those found guilty, execution by strangulation and being burnt at the stake. Still, it's not out of the realm of possibility that her case could have been dropped and Gowdy let free. Regardless, why did Isabel Gowdy confess in such detail? Well, this is what has puzzled historians for quite some time. While it's often cited that the confessions were made without the use of torture or coaxing, it's not much of a stretch to assume that she was under some form of pressure. She wasn't imprisoned in the best of conditions during her stay. She was kept in solitary confinement, likely without adequate resources and sleep. There are some other theories that have been brought up. Many assume that she genuinely believed her confessions, while the other party thinks that she intentionally misled investigators. The former theorizes that she was not in a healthy state of mind. While the coven may have existed in some form, the more exaggerated parts were fabricated by an ill mind that conceived itself of their reality. This delusional state could have been brought on by a number of things. It could have been a result of the isolated and poor conditions she was met with, insomnia and malnutrition. She could have had an undiagnosed mental illness or been poisoned by ergot, a fungus that grows on rye that is known to cause hallucinations. Now, the other side claims that Isabel Gowdy was in complete control of her words, and while she knew they were false, carefully crafted and fabricated them in a way to fit her purpose. She was not in control of the narrative being spun of her by the investigation. However, she could control what her story would be, and made the most of her situation. One popular idea is that the confessions were meant to frighten the local minister, who had a fear of witchcraft, being present at all of her confessions. Those accused no doubt had a disdain for this man. Perhaps this was some semblance of revenge, making him believe his worst fears were true, and covens of witches with unimaginable power and horror were all around him. It's unlikely that the truth behind Isabel Gowdy's confessions nor the reasoning behind their detailed and elaborate and seemingly voluntary retellings will ever be revealed. Still, whatever her motives were, it's undeniable that this obscure and illiterate peasant woman had a very descriptive and creative imagination, one that has given history one of the most compelling and detailed witch confessions and stories to draw from. It's unclear if any of these Scottish women were actually practicing witches, meaning they attempted these dark practices and believed themselves capable of these powers, or if they were just more innocent women whose names were added to the long list of injustice in the name of witchcraft. The truth is lost to history. Instead, all that's left is the questions of who these women actually were and what life they actually led. One thing that can be taken away from all of these witch hunts and trials is how local folklore gets distorted into being a thing of the devil, fairies and elves being pawns in the hands of the devil and existing for malicious purposes. While these women were often more familiar with the legend of fairies and elves more so than even the devil, investigators were known to combine the two, smearing the accused in one of the many instances where local folklore and Christianity collide. When we think of a witch nowadays, we tend to conjure up an image of an ostracized woman during more recent centuries. Christian areas were fearful of the strange and unknown ways of so-called witches, and this is the time period where witch trials were at their peak. However, the idea of witches and witchcraft, outcast from society practicing dark magic, worshipping unusual deities, and thought to possess unnatural powers has been around since the beginning of religion. Whether it be a woman that held too much power for society's liking, or just that they never quite assimilated into the community. The ancient world is full of sorcerers that serve as precursors to witches that helped drive this concept for millennia. One of the earliest depictions is the legend of the Enchantress Circe from the Odyssey. In this epic, written by Homer in the 8th century BC, Circe is not an ugly hag. Instead, she is considered quite beautiful and draws sailors to her island with her lovely singing. But it is her powers on the island, when Odysseus encounters her, that make her worth discussing for this topic. Circe was a sorceress and possessed many of the qualities one would associate with witches today. She was able to transform men into animals such as pigs. She had a vast knowledge of herbs and natural ingredients that she could create a vast array of potions with. The sorceress possessed tremendous power and used a magical wand. Now, while Circe is just a myth, her story does illustrate this idea of sorcery in the ancient world, one that had real-life consequences as well. Magic, or at least the belief in it, has been around since the beginning of recorded history. And along with that, the belief that some people possess these powers. There are ancient stories of both good and evil deeds that have come from these magicians as they'd be known. Magic in the ancient world was understood much differently than in modern times. Still, the ancient concept of magic bears much similarity to the witchcraft of later ages. There are tales of cursed relics, powerful spells, magical potions, cures, and poisons. Objects that can be imbued with power for both harm and protection. While practicing magic was a powerful tool used in storytelling, it was thought to be able to impact everyday life in ancient Greece. A lot of magic in Greece would involve the use of enchanted relics. One of the more popular of these was amulets. These could be necklaces or bracelets and served a multitude of purposes. An amulet could protect against harm or aid in physical healing. It could bring favorable weather to a farmer, bring luck, attract a companion, and even be used as a contraceptive. While these amulets, which were often made from wood, bone, stone, and even gems, could protect the wearer or the location where they were placed, there were also some darker relics that could be crafted for the more sinister magician. Curses could be placed on an individual or, in more extreme cases, their entire family. One method of accomplishing this was the use of a tablet, which could be made of metal, stone, or clay and have the curse carved into it and then be buried. This could be used for several purposes, some of them even by the ruling party. Murderers and violent criminals who pose serious threat to society may find themselves being cursed, or the losing side of a dispute may become a victim to a curse. These curse tablets could be used as a means for revenge or to further one's own means. There were also various spells, potions, and poisons that existed in ancient Greece which could be used to enhance one's own life or harm others. There would be laws forbidding the use of destructive magic and repercussions for those who disobeyed. Plato himself weighed in with his input, saying that those who dabbled in evil magic and created curse tablets should be punished. There are several notable cases of evil magic with potentially severe results and dire consequences for those involved. The death penalty was a possibility for those found guilty. with one case coming from the 5th century BC describing a case where an entire family suffered this verdict after using harmful magic. However, in the following century, the 4th century BC, one of the world's oldest but most well-known witch trials would take place in ancient Greece. Horace of Lemnos was a woman living in Athens. She was known as a healer and provided various potions and incantations meant to heal a variety of ailments. She may have also provided other magical services, and it seems she may have earned a respectable amount of wealth obtained from her practices. Her exact crimes are unknown and remain a debated topic for scholars, but Demosthenes seems to imply that she gave out bad incantations and poisonous medicine, while others say it was a crime of impiety or going against the gods. Regardless, Horace would be put to trial and along with her children were found guilty and sentenced to death. With this ruling, Horace would become one of the earliest examples of a witch trial. Still, within ancient Greece, practices that involved magic and sorcery were not always evil. They could actually serve a more important and rewarding purpose for society. Practitioners could be revered for their ability. Perhaps the best example of this is with the oracles. While it may not be accurate to call an oracle a sorcerer, it shouldn't be too much of a stretch to at least compare the two. Oracles were spiritual mediums of the ancient Greek world. They could be found at various temples that were devoted to specific gods. The oracles possessed the ability to communicate with their connected god, allowing them to be a bridge for those who wished to speak with them. One could approach the oracle and ask their questions to the gods, who would relay their answers back to them. Obviously, such power gave the oracles significant influence over society, and although essentially practitioners of magic, they held a position of great prestige. While there were many oracles in ancient Greece, the most well-known is the Oracle of Delphi. Known as the Pythia, a woman over 50 years old served as a medium for the god Apollo at the magnificent temple in Delphi. The Pythia, a title given to multiple priestesses, had fame that was far-reaching as many individuals, including important figures, would come from all over to hear the wisdom of Apollo via his oracle vessel. Political moves and war efforts could rest on the shoulders of the Pythia, who is believed to have foretold the future. Ancient Greece gives us several examples of what would today be considered a witch. The Greeks were very distrustful of outsiders. The widespread use of magic in the Hellenistic world leads to many different stories. However, the most extensive knowledge of magic and sorcery obtained from the ancient world actually comes from ancient Babylon. In Babylon, both good and bad magic is described in detail, as well as the more malicious witches that terrified the ancient kingdom. Babylon has an extensive history of sorcery and witchcraft, and many of the practices of medieval and modern times are directly influenced by their Babylonian ancestors. Magic and sorcery in Babylon is a very broad and engaging topic, but to keep it simple, there seems to be two different parties of practitioners. One is the priests, who practice to further the desires of the kingdom, and the other is individuals who practice to further their own interests. Priests would often be consulted by kings for their wisdom, but witches and wizards, who practiced without the authority of their rulers, would be severely punished. In the Code of Commentarii, there were specific instructions on how to deal with outlaw sorcerers. The law states that the accuser must prove their charge of sorcery against the accused. If successful, the house of the sorcerer would go to the accusing party. The sorcerer would be thrown into a river, where if he did not drown, he would be found not guilty. Being wrongly accused, the now innocent party would be entitled to their accuser's house, who would now be put to death for their false accusations. Such a code was brutal, but in a way perhaps discouraged people to falsely accuse their neighbors of sorcery and witchcraft. As for what outlawed magical practices included, there is an extensive list. Magic in Babylon has some very dark aspects, from summoning demons and spirits to exorcisms, sacrifices, to much more. Still, these practices could be acceptable depending on the party involved. Babylonian witches are actually described in detail by various ancient texts, and one can see the similarities and inspiration of witches that would appear much later in history. They could be seen as hags roaming the dark streets of Babylon, searching for victims, men to ensnare and women to harm. They hide in the shadows, crafting harmful spells. Ancient prayers exist that speak of wishing for protections against these witches, and for their evil spells to be cast back into their mouths that speak such vile, repulsive curses. May her mouth be fat, may her tongue be salt. So what exactly were witches and wizards thought to have done? Well, with Babylonian sorcery, we again see its influence on witchcraft, and even the occult of later periods. The magic here is very spiritual, as it encompasses a lot of aspects that have to do with other realms, such as the spirit world and the nether realm. There are descriptions of possessions and exorcisms, summonings and bewitchings. What may be surprising for such an ancient society is the belief in vampires. Unfortunately, many are not as familiar with Babylonian mythology as other ancient beliefs, one that is heavily based on the roots of demonic entities. Now, the incredibly interesting folklore of ancient Babylon is way too long for this already too long video, so instead I'm going to provide just a bit of a foundation for us to work with. For our purposes, what you should understand about Babylonian mythology, or just ancient Mesopotamia for that matter, is how spirits and demons operate. Spirits in the Babylonian world were treated a bit differently than other cultures. The Great Bello was a realm beneath ours that housed the deceased. It was neither a punishment nor a reward, heaven nor hell, but rather just a realm where we all go and return to the possession of the gods. Now, that may be a bleak idea, but it was also one that had a heavy reliance on the idea of spirits. Burial was extremely important in ancient Babylon, as the grave was the home the dead were meant to dwell in. However, if the deceased were left unburied, this is where ghosts would come from. Unable to rest, to be in their natural home, these lost spirits dwell in the world of the living no longer meant for them. They would eat the garbage of the ancient streets, and find homes which they would haunt. They'd drive people to madness, or scare others to death, being in a constant state of spite for being denied their longing of death. Unnatural to the living world in which they no longer belong, but trapped without a proper burial, dying violently, unmarried, without children, or by drowning, could cause a spirit to overstay its welcome. These lost spirits, although not always hostile, would be a hindrance on society by haunting and causing harm to the living. Now, these ghosts, or spirits, are different to the more evil demons. They were once among the world above. They were alive, but for whatever reason now lack rest. However, demons are something else entirely. They preferred to dwell in the shadows of the world, graves atop mountains, and in abandoned ruins. However, their presence in the night included much mischief and mayhem. They were thought to be responsible for disease, plague, and pestilence, for hatred, jealousy, and quarrels. They were also thought responsible for natural disasters and strong weather. Really, much of the world's issues stemmed from either lost souls of the dead or hidden demons causing anguish. The spirits of Babylon are similar in hostility to that of the aforementioned European fairies of folklore. Naturally, with the existence of such beings came the need for exorcisms. Exorcists would make a living off expelling such spiritual beings, either through the release of a trapped soul to their rightful home or the banishment of demons from the area, or even a possessed individual. They were believed to cure a lot of pestilence and wrongdoing that may have permeated a community. While exorcism could be seen as a good use of magic, as it removes unwanted spirits and demons, it had a more sinister counterpart, conjuration. This is where the more evil aspects of Babylonian sorcery arise. Conjuration, in simple terms, is the summoning of demons and evil spirits. Now, as you might guess, for a civilization that wholeheartedly believed this type of stuff, doing something as taboo as this was more than just frowned upon. Summoning demons to inflict misery on society was something only the most wicked would do, and something every Babylonian would fear. Still, conjuration was not nearly as popular as its more mundane but still immoral sibling, necromancy. Not to be confused, conjuration is the summoning of demons and evil spirits, while necromancy is summoning ghosts and spirits, the resurrection of the dead, most often to communicate with, but also to do one's bidding. They could hold knowledge and wisdom otherwise unattainable. Because of these strong beliefs, necromancy thrived as an industry. Now, necromancy is a broad category, but is usually seen as a more sinister branch of magic and witchcraft. Contrary to more modern depictions, which portray necromancers as sorcerers that forcefully summon the unwilling souls of the dead to do their bidding, with the reanimation of corpses and the communion of souls from other realms. But that's not usually the case in ancient Babylon. Still, in ancient times, necromancy, while still controversial, did not have the same disdain one might carry centuries later. At least, not all the time. It usually depended on who was the one practicing and who commissioned the service. Necromancy could actually be an important aspect for society. Babylon would be one such civilization that necromancy would have a role in. Necromancy back then usually involved rituals to summon the spirits of the dead. In Babylon, such spirits were called etemu. Necromancy was widespread in the ancient world, and it served a very useful purpose for practitioners. While conversing with spirits, one had access to their once lost knowledge. Whether it be one's ancestor or one of the wisest deceased scholars, necromancers had access to a spiritual library holding the world's forgotten knowledge. One could receive spiritual guidance that could not only forge the path of their own life, but the paths of civilizations. Still, as with most forms of so-called magic, necromancy would eventually be seen in a much more malicious light. Perhaps the best example of necromancy once being an important aspect of ancient society, but now being seen as dark, evil, and forbidden, is its presence within the Bible. Bone conjurers and warnings against such practices are referenced, but the more substantial figure is the Witch of Endor. In the story, King Saul, after driving out practitioners of magic from the area, seeks out and tasks the witch with summoning the spirit of the recently deceased Samuel. Saul was seeking the guidance that God was not providing him. While the mindset of the time may not see this as unusual nor perhaps evil, later Christian writers would condemn the notion of summoning and speaking with the dead. The new belief was that if magic and necromancy were not real, and it was impossible to communicate with the dead, then it must be a demonic entity in its stead. One thing that ancient necromancers tell us is that there is wisdom to be obtained from such spiritual practices. Still, those who practice magic weren't always seen as evil or lesser members of society. They could be well-respected important members, but when they weren't, it was a very taboo practice. It isn't hard to imagine the evil made possible by such practices. Bringing back unwilling souls and even attempting to reanimate corpses is among the dangers of necromancy. Belief in magic and sorcery was very strong in Babylon, and with it came just as strong a hatred for the evil witches and wizards that used its power for dark purposes. There exists ancient cuneiform tablets that tell of what witches are, how to rid the community of them, and how to punish such evil. One tablet, Maklu, which ominously translates to burning, gives instructions for a ritualistic ceremony to fend off witches. Usually performed on a night in Abu, which is now considered the months of July and August, it could be performed whenever witchcraft was suspected to have infiltrated the area, whether it be the grip of the mountain, be it the epilepsy, the offspring of Salpeia, or another form of witchcraft or protection from such things. The ritual begins with figurines in the likeness of sorcerers being burned. They would be drowned in black liquid and placed face down, where they'd subsequently be crushed. Meanwhile, the tablets would be spoken aloud. Pure oven, great daughter of Anu, inside whom the fire of the grave is flaring, inside whom the valiant fire god has taken up residence, whose flames have reached the sky. Burn, set alight, incinerate my witch. May my warlock's and witch's life swiftly, quickly come to an end. The rest of the ritual involved the fumigation of one's house and the purification of oneself, including the massaging and washing carried out into the morning hours. Finally, ending in a moment of self-reflection in a bowl of water. The prayers recited from the tablets during this ceremony were meant to rid the community of witches and warlocks, of sorcerers and wizards. Other tablets and recordings also describe sorcerers and how to deal with them, such as in Labartu, which translates to witch hag, which tells us of the demon goddess Labartu, often associated with such evil, who consumes the flesh, blood, and bones of her victims. The hag demon particularly sought out children. Charms could be worn as protection from Labartu, who dwelled in the swamps. Demonology made up a large portion of Babylonian culture, and by extension, witches would play an unwelcomed role. These outlaw sorcerers were known to use other means of torment as well, such as the evil eye, that could inflict suffering upon their victims. Still, we see magic and sorcery being both good and evil, depending on who casted the spells. If you were the town's exorcist, you were okay. If you were the village witch, you had to be dealt with. What these ancient practices show us is how magic was understood by the ancient world, a complicated concept that would have very strong influences on society. However, eventually the likes of magicians and sorcery would evolve into that of witches and witchcraft. While we see magic being used for both good and evil, and while we see both acceptance and punishment, it's in ancient Rome that witches and witchcraft become much more recognizable. Magic in Rome perhaps wasn't as widespread and as important a belief as it was in Greece and especially Babylon, but it still had a place. We still see magic as both good and evil, however we see that magic must fall in line with the religion of Rome. Anything else runs the risk of not being seen in the best light. This might be when in history accusations of witchcraft came hand in hand with that of larger scale persecution and witch hunts to both drive out competing religions and tarnish rivals' characters. That is, if the state didn't like you, they would ruin you. However, before we get into all of that, first let's look at what exactly a witch in ancient Rome would be characterized as. The most common witch would play an ostracized but useful role for their fellow citizens. These witches, who were usually women, were mostly shunned by the community. However, it wouldn't be uncommon for their services to be called upon. Anything deemed unusual or unnatural could get the label of being a witch. Women who dealt in herbs, remedies, and medical care. There were also more sinister forms, or at least believed to be. Perhaps the best description of an evil witch comes from the Roman poet and author Lucan, who tells of a vile witch by the name of El Ricto. In a rather elaborate description, El Ricto closely resembles the iconic version of the witch. She is an ugly, old hag, the witch's face haggard, vile with neglect. She is not allowed to reside in the cities. It was a crime for her to shelter her evil head under a roof by a city hearth. Because of this, she dwells in the cemeteries, her only shelter being the abandoned tombs where she resides, living amongst the shades, the ghosts of the dead. She remains hidden, out of sight during the day, only emerging at night to perform her depraved deeds. When black clouds and tempest drown the stars, she will emerge from empty tombs and trap nocturnal lightning. Her tread blights the seed in the rich fields. Her breath poisons the untainted air. She emits both darkness and putridness, surrounded by a black aura reeking of rotting corpses. This in no small part due to the wicked things she does at night when she emerges from the shadows. Lucan speaks on several atrocities committed on the resting dead and the panicking living. The latter she is said to bury alive. Living spirits, still in control of their bodies, she buries in the grave, and while fate still owes them years, death strikes against their will. However, death will not save you from the corruption of Ulricto. The witch was also a powerful necromancer and was said to reanimate the dead to do her bidding. However, aside from being a gatekeeper of life and death, another twisted thing Ulricto does is her grotesque desecration of corpses. For it's when these bodies begin to decompose that Ulricto's feast can begin. Thrusting her fingers deep in the eye sockets, scooping out the solidified eyeballs in delight, gnawing the yellowed nails on withered hands. She steals nails that have pierced hands, the clotted gore and the black residues of putrefaction that oozed all over the limbs, and hangs her weight on sinews that resist her teeth. She'll wait for wolves to tear into bodies so that she can steal the flesh from their jaws. She'll slit the throats of the living if she desires warm blood. Her vile deeds do not end there, however, as she seems to have some dark intentions with the body parts she collects as she gathers these repulsive ingredients for some wicked rituals and horrific spells. Thus, she pierces the womb and extracts the child, not as nature intended, in order to set it in the altar flames. And when a cruel and forceful ghost is wanted, she takes its life herself. Every man's death serves her turn. Now, before we get into the rest of Ulricto's tale, it's important to understand some context. Ulricto was a Thessalian witch. Now, regardless of Ulricto being more of a legend, Thessaly, a region within Greece, was traditionally known for its witches, being considered a witch haven, a cradle for witchcraft and sorcery. Why exactly this is up for debate. However, what is not is the association and synonymous nature of the two, with Thessaly becoming just another word for witchcraft. Numerous stories and references speak of Thessaly being full of witches and curious individuals traveling there for a glimpse of the dark practices of sorcery. The validity of such claims is questionable, but the belief persisted for centuries that the wilderness of Thessaly held dark secrets. Still, the region during this era was associated with witches and sorcery, with spells, potions, poisons, and rituals. With the story of Ulricto, we see the image of the witch Rome commonly envisioned upon Thessaly. So back to the story of Ulricto. During the Roman civil war between Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar, there was much bloodshed. The witch delighted in this and hoped the battles would remain in Thessaly. She hoped to mutilate the corpses of slain kings, plunder the ashes of the Roman people, and the bones of noblemen, and master the ghosts of the great. Her sole labor and passion was to snatch what part she could of Pompey's outstretched corpse, pounce on what of Caesar's limbs she might. We see a hag, a depraved of humanity, so foreign to the idea of Roman sophistication, let alone even a shred of civility. When Pompey's son Sextus seeks her out, desiring her wisdom, she would agree and scour the battlefield for a suitable corpse. After finding the unfortunate soul, she would perform a deranged necromantic ritual, returning the soul to the body to tell Sextus of the fate to come. Now, what the relevance of such a tale is the depiction of witches in Rome. Usually Thessalian in origin, depraved individuals, usually women who'd performed evil spells and created unnatural potions. Crones that hid in the darkest shadows of the world, emerging with sadistic intentions. Witches lived strongly in the minds of Roman writers and poets. Another colorful description of a witch comes from another Roman poet, this time Horace, as he describes a witch by the name of Canidia. These witches were a detailed inclusion in the folklore mythology of Rome. However, their influence would seep into reality as well. Just as we saw with Greece and Babylon, Rome was not above taking real-world measures to fend off the dark powers of witchcraft. Believed to be capable of destroying and stealing harvests as well as massive disasters such as famine, earthquakes, and plague. Laws would be put into place to quell such terrible things. Because of their strong beliefs, and in part by wanting to do away with undesirables and political and religious competition, Rome would be one of the first to conduct a more primitive version of witch hunts. One of the earliest and most notable of these occurred in 331 BC. The historian Livy, who himself doubted the authenticity of the case, tells of when 170 people were prosecuted for mass poisoning, likely occurring during an epidemic. A slave girl told officials that the fatalities were the result of Roman women brewing and distributing poisons. Upon being caught in the act of creating these concoctions and being questioned, the women were made to drink their own brews and prove their claims that it was harmless. They would all die as a result, and after names were given out, 170 women would be charged and found guilty of poisoning. although their ultimate fate seems lost to history. This wouldn't be an isolated case. Throughout the centuries, similar trials would be conducted. During times of plague, women would often be suspected of causing the pestilence, being prosecuted and then executed for crimes lacking sufficient evidence. However, the most infamous poisoner in Rome was Locusta. Born into obscurity in Gaul, sometime in the 1st century AD, Locusta's skills as an herbalist would end up finding her a place in Rome. At some point, Locusta would be captured from Gaul and would end up serving the Emperor Nero. With fears of being poisoned and desires to poison others infiltrating the Roman Empire, poisoners would become a hot commodity, and Nero found himself one of the best. However, before she would end up serving the Emperor, Locusta would first serve Nero's mother, the Empress Agrippina the Younger, during the years of Emperor Claudius's reign. In 54 AD, Locusta was already imprisoned on poisoning charges. Despite, or perhaps because of this, Locusta was approached by Agrippina. The Empress desired for the Gaulish poisoner to supply her with a poison to kill her own husband, the Emperor himself. Locusta complied, although she likely had little choice. This assassination had several conspirators, including the food taster who poured the poison supplied by Locusta on Claudius's food, which happened to be mushrooms. However, the dosage was not enough to kill the Emperor. Another conspirator, the Doctor, would actually finish him off when he put a feather laced with more poison down his throat. A practice usually meant to induce vomiting, but in this case having more sinister motivations. Locusta's indirect involvement with Roman politics wouldn't end there, however. As soon, Locusta, who was still imprisoned, would be approached again for her services, this time by Agrippina's son, the new emperor, Nero. This is where the story gets much more darker. Claudius had another son, by a woman other than Agrippina, Britannicus, who was Nero's stepbrother. Although only being 13 years old, Nero perceived Britannicus as a threat to his throne, and like his mother before, went to the poisoner for a means to deal with his potential challenger. The idea was for the assassination to be as subtle as possible. However, this wouldn't be the case, as the dosage once again given by Locusta was not lethal enough to kill. An infuriated Nero would flog Locusta himself as punishment, demanding a stronger poison. Nero was said to supply Locusta with children and animals to test out her poisons on, until the right one was found. Within mere months of Claudius's death, Britannicus would endure a similar fate. When given a drink too hot to consume, water laced with poison was poured into the cup. And an unfortunate fate would befall the young boy, as one can only imagine as the present Nero, watching with hidden joy, telling those in attendance it was an epileptic seizure. This time, Nero was more than pleased and not only issued a full pardon, freeing Locusta, but also rewarded her with estates of her very own. Nero would take a liking to Locusta, and even more so to her unmatched knowledge and skills with poisons. He would even send pupils to her and have them trained under her watch, increasing his arsenal of skilled poisoners. It has also been claimed that Nero would send victims to her for her to test out her deadly concoctions on. For all these reasons, Locusta is often cited as one of the world's first serial killers. Locusta had gone from likely being a slave captured from Gaul to now being a high-ranking member of Nero's court, as his go-to counsel for assassinations and all things poison, which she frequently would turn to. She now enjoyed a life of luxury and prestige. However, with Nero's suicide in 68 AD, her fortune and more importantly her protection was now forfeit. It would not be long after that his successor Emperor Galba would condemn Locusta and others, the scum that had come to surface in Nero's days, to be executed. Her exact fate is unknown, but she was chained and brought through the streets to the place where she would meet her end. There is a myth that she was executed in a horrific way by wild animals, but this is simply not true. Rome could be quite brutal, but it's more plausible she was simply beheaded. Locusta furthered the idea of women using poisons to unnaturally end people's lives. However, accusing women of poisoning wouldn't be the only form of persecution of supposed witchcraft. While Rome was suspicious of women in high-ranking positions, they were also suspicious of competing religions and ideologies. This could be seen in the 186 BC case, when those worshipping Bacchus would be condemned for crimes such as mass poisoning. In Rome, there existed many cults that would often focus their worship on a specific god. There were many of these mystery cults, those who worshipped Dionysus, Orpheus, Persephone, and other Greek and Roman figures, but also those that worshipped Persian or Egyptian figures. Now, these mystery cults are a topic for another day, but essentially they existed all across the Greek and Roman world as smaller religious schools, known for their secrecy and their customs and beliefs, hiding their practices from the outside world, and their elaborate initiation rituals reserved only for the devoted. Now, these cults were actually usually tolerated by Rome, aware of their vast empire including many religious backgrounds. Rome would allow these worships and the continuation of their culture of their conquered peoples as a means for peace and prosperity. Still, these cults weren't always looked upon favorably by the Roman state, one such being the cult of Isis, worshipping the Egyptian god. The cult was becoming increasingly popular with the Roman people. and a challenge for the existing Roman religion. The Roman authorities believed this mystery cult, whose practices were unknown, to be overly sexualized and problematic. Wanting to do away with this troublesome religion, Emperor Tiberius would get his excuse to strike. When a scandal involving a priest and a Roman girl broke, Tiberius had the cult's members crucified and the idols of Isis destroyed. Ironically, it would be the notorious Caligula who would restore the cult. Now, it wouldn't be entirely accurate to equate these cults to witchcraft. However, it illustrates Rome's distrust with the unknown. People of a foreign ideology that would be smeared. Still, practicing witches had a matron deity of their own to worship, and it seems many may have had a unifying religion of sorts. The main focus of worship was to the goddess Hecate, who became associated with all things involving witchcraft, sorcery, necromancy, ghosts, and knowledge of herbs and poisons. For this, she is thought to have been revered by the witches of Thessaly. Hecate herself is a mysterious figure in Greek mythology. Her description is actually a bit all over the place as her origins are unclear. She is said to be the mother of the Enchantress Circe. Still, she has a lot in common with the more well-known goddess of the hunt, Artemis, being associated with the moon, hunting, and dogs. Due to this, it's thought that Hecate may have been a foreign deity accepted into the Greek pantheon. She almost seems like a darker, corrupted version of Artemis or Diana, although she is described as both good and evil. For whatever reason, this mysterious goddess would be depicted with 3 faces and be known as a gatekeeper of life and death. Many cults existed over the Greek and Roman worlds that worshipped Hecate. These cults often included sacrificial offerings, such as dogs, which became associated with the moon due to howling. Hecate would often be called upon by witches and sorcerers to lend them strength, and it wouldn't be uncommon to find her name on curse tablets. Still, Hecate was one part of this early witchcraft religion. The moon would be a symbolic image for witches that emerged under the light of Luna, the divine representation of the moon, known as Selene in the Greek tradition. Hecate, Luna, as well as Proserpina, also known by the Greeks as Persephone, the wife of Hades, would form the triple-faced goddess. This Roman triple goddess or triple deity would become strongly associated with witchcraft and witches, as well as modern Wicca. What further complicates this is Artemis, or the Romanized Diana, is considered a triple goddess as well, with different versions saying Diana and Hecate are one and the same, or 2 parts of the same goddess, with Luna and Persephone also being included. Regardless of the confusion from then and now, Artemis or Diana, Luna or Selene, Persephone or Proserpina, and most prominently Hecate or Hecate, all represent a bigger picture that is the main focus of worship for these ancient witches: the moon, the hunt, the night, the underworld, the unknown. This unholy trinity would be called upon by witches as seen in Lucan's description of Oricto. Before the hag performs her necromantic ritual, she calls upon the rotting goddess, Persephone, who shuns her mother in heaven, and the third form of our patroness, Hecate, through whom the shades and I converse silently. She later describes Hecate's appearance that mirrors one of a decaying crone. And you, Hecate, all pale and withered in form, who paint your face before you visit the gods above, I will show them you as you are, and prevent you from altering your hellish form. I shall speak aloud about that food which confines Proserpines beneath the vast weight of earth above. Hecate was not always the goddess of witchcraft, but through her spheres of influence she strongly became associated as such, and the witches of ancient Rome seem to have embraced her as their deity. And thus we see her description tarnished, no longer one of beauty, but one that more closely resembles the depravity of those believed to have been worshipping her. Still, it wasn't just witches from Thessaly, or shrouded areas that would gather at night to worship the moon. Anyone was capable of witchcraft. In one final story, one that combines the corruption of Tiberius, the use of poisons, and the suspicion of witchcraft, we see all these things come together. Germanicus was a famed general of the Roman Empire, famed for his accomplishments and loved by the people. The decorated war hero would even become the adopted son of Emperor Tiberius, being the heir to the throne. Still, despite his impressive resume, it's his death that has puzzled historians for millennia. Germanicus would fall ill, eventually succumbing to his ill state and dying, with poison being the suspected cause. Blame quickly fell on a statesman named Piso, a widely disliked politician. With the accusations going all the way to implicating Tiberius himself, the emperor with little choice ordered the investigation into Piso. It's said that when the house was searched, within the walls and under the floors, some truly horrific things were discovered. Upon ashes and blood were deceased bodies, various spells and curse tablets with Germanicus' name inscribed. All of this evidence strongly pointed to witchcraft, with Piso's wife being implemented as well. Piso would never learn of his trial's resolution, as he would take his own life by slitting his throat. However, he would actually be acquitted of the murder of Germanicus. The damage was done, however, and Tiberius's reputation would never truly recover. Historians now debate the true extent and authenticity of the findings and question whether Germanicus was even poisoned at all or simply died of natural causes. Still, witchcraft and sorcery played its role in the politics of Rome, and regardless of its shaky reality, led to the prosecution and destruction of many, a precursor to the suffering yet to come for thousands in the coming centuries under the label of witch. Shamanism has existed in some form since the times of hunters and gatherers, with early man's cave paintings depicting the practice lasting as long as this prehistoric tradition. A shaman is a religious leader of sorts. Through wisdom or magic, they are connected to the other realms of existence, and spiritually connected with the earth. Traditionally, shamans are seen as wise and spiritual. They are not all too dissimilar to a priest of sorts. They perform in ceremonies and rituals, provide spiritual guidance. They can communicate with the other realms, sometimes going into a trance-like state. This figure has existed all across the world's cultures and all throughout history, even into the modern day. However, it's the European versions that I'd like to discuss today. One of the earliest and most influential of these European shamans is the Druids, which have fascinated historians for centuries. Druids were the shamanistic class of the Celts, residing in what is now Britain and France. Made up of Gaels, Gauls, Bretons, and others, the Celts were tribal in nature and commanded much of Europe for many centuries until being displaced. For the Celtic pagan society, a mysterious figure would serve as their religious and spiritual leader, a guide between realms. With the Celts keeping little to no records of their own, Julius Caesar, believe it or not, is our primary source of knowledge about the Druids. Caesar, having invaded Gaul, tells us that the community had two distinct and important classes, the nobles of course, and also the Druids. They held many responsibilities such as judging disputes and deciding punishments, with the ability to ostracize individuals from attending religious ceremonies such as sacrifices, which we'll come back to. They were guides that people could approach to seek wisdom. Now, while there was typically only one chief druid at a time, many would take up the practice, spending as much as 20 years learning philosophy, astronomy, and about the gods in ancient verses which they would often speak in. Being a druid had privileges as well, with druids being immune to military service and paying taxes and tribute. One of the darker aspects of druid life was their involvement in human sacrifices, which always required a druid to lead the ceremony. While sacrifices would vary in scale and method, the most notable form is the Wicker Man. Preferring to use criminals, druids would resort to innocents if supply was low. Huge effigies in the shape of a man would be constructed, made of wicker and hollow inside. Dozens of men, still alive, crowded within, toppled on top of one another, would pack the wooden prison full. What would be a horrific show for us today was a spectacle of awe for the Celts in attendance, as the sacrifices to come would bring favor with the gods. The druid would then take a lit torch and begin burning the kindling placed at the bottom of the wicker statue, with the towering effigy soon to be ignited in flame. The fire reaching up into the sky, the screams of men trapped inside piercing through the night, and the smell of burning flesh permeating through the air. The Wicker Man is one of the more extreme examples of human sacrifice, and this custom would no doubt seem barbaric to someone like Julius Caesar, although it's doubtful he actually witnessed such a thing in person. Things such as this would serve as kindling of its own when pagans would be judged as evil and their practices being blended together in what would later become witchcraft. Still, while it's fair to compare the druid impact on the image of the witch, it's not entirely fair to call a druid a witch. With all these so-called witches we've discussed, they've usually had one major thing in common. They are all outcasts. Disgraces of society that practice dark arts, black magic, and perform many taboo acts, sacrifices being one of those. But with the druids, we see the opposite. We see these sorcerers being praised, privileged, and powerful members of society, above all but nobles. Of course, this level of respect wouldn't be applied to druids outside of places such as Gaul, as the Romans showed little mercy or respect to the druids, slaughtering them and destroying sacred sites and temples. Following the conquest of their lands and the loss of much of their culture, the druids would be further driven into obscurity by Rome, including the ever-oppressive Emperor Tiberius. Much of the truth involving the druids is lost to history, with very few records detailing the people. Still, they also had a role in the mythology of their people, such as Irish folklore. In the various, albeit limited records that exist outside of Caesar's account and other Roman historians, we see female druids, and we also see them being described with magical powers such as shape-shifting and healing abilities. For the Romans, the druids were a high-ranking class of their neighbors to the west. They possessed elements of society to make them not primitive, but they were savage and barbaric in nature, much like Thessaly and its witches. Britain and Gaul and its druids were beneath the civilized world. Not irredeemable, just lacking Roman guidance. While the druids' domain was extensive, it wouldn't be found east of the Rhine, in the Germanic lands. Instead, one might find something else, a seeress. These exclusively female sorcerers held much sway over their community. Thought to be able to predict the future, the prophecies foretold by the seeress were considered paramount. Described as virgins, these prophetesses would have a similar role to that of the Greek oracles of old. With the use of wands and magic, these women would more than likely appear witch-like to the invading Romans. These seeresses seem to typically be elder, unmarried women. They seem to be reclusive, yet leaders for their tribes. It would be foolish to ignore their wisdom. The tribe respected and believed in the seeress, and in turn the seeress devoted her life to the well-being of the tribe. And what would be a foreign concept in many cultures of the time, including the Romans, would be how Germanic people viewed females as prophetic in nature, having a pre-existing potential for spirituality. In one story, we see how important seeresses were to their tribes, especially in times of conflict. With one tribe, the Cimbri, being said to have a particularly gruesome tradition. When enemies would be taken as prisoners, the seeress would pay them a visit. They would be placed so that their necks would be over a vase while the priestess assumed a position above them and raised a sword. She would cut the throat of each prisoner that had been lifted up, and from the blood that poured forth into the vessel, some of the priestesses would draw a prophecy, while still others would split open the body, and from an inspection of the entrails, would utter a prophecy of victory for their own people. And during the battles, they would beat on the hides that were stretched over the wicker bodies of the wagons, and in this way would produce an unearthly noise. History tells us of several prominent Germanic seeresses during the time of Rome. Little is known about many of these, however, besides their name and their association with the most famous seeress of Germanic culture, Velida. By the year 70 AD, Velida was already a famed and admired priestess in the lands east of the Rhine. Residing in a tower along the river where she was revered for her wisdom and seeing. However, it would be during the coming uprising of the Batavi tribe against Rome where she would truly forge her name in history. Led by the auxiliary officer Gaius Julius Civilis, the Batavi tribe's revolt would inflict unexpected wounds to both the legions and pride of Rome. With their early successes, they'd be joined by other tribes wishing to throw off Roman influence. At some point, perhaps before the rebellion or shortly after, the rebels would be embraced by Velida, giving them much-needed encouragement. She foretold the Batavi's victory and the destruction of Roman legions. At first, her visions proved true as the rebellion saw success against Rome. The Romans would begin to take an interest in Velida, aware of her influence and perhaps curious in her visions which had been accurately predicted. A Roman commander was sent to Velida's tower, however he would mysteriously die before he could arrive, further adding to her intrigue. Unfortunately, despite early success, the rebellion would not win in the end. The Batavi, forced to accept less than ideal conditions, and Civilis' fate lost to history. However, Velida's story does not end there, nor Rome's fascination with her. Following their defeat, and in 77 AD, Velida would be taken by Rome, either as a prisoner or as a guest granted asylum. It seems she lived out her remaining days in Rome, who still found intrigue with the priestess, and it seems she may have ended up aiding Rome and living comfortably, though there is very little detail on her life. Despite their significance of the time and their legends surrounding them, the Germanic seeresses during the time of Rome have very little recorded history about them. However, this would not be the last time we see seeresses in history, as this ancient art was passed through the centuries and through cultures. Now for that though, we must travel north, a journey to Scandinavia and the Viking Age. Here it seems the seeress evolves into its Viking counterpart, the vulva. These sorceresses would have an important role within the brutal and pagan culture of the Vikings, further adding to the harsh image their enemies held of them. In terms of mythology, the vulva is involved in many significant stories and they are often associated with the goddess Freya. A seeress is also present in the creation story. In what is one of the primary records for much of Norse mythology, the vulva tells Odin of the origins of the universe and its creatures. She tells her knowledge of Odin's secrets and of his missing eye sacrificed for knowledge. She ends by telling of Ragnarok, the end of the world, as well as its rebirth. From this seeress we learn much of Norse mythology, from the creation of the world and its creatures to the fate of the gods and destruction of all. This is a very important tale and it shows the power held by the vulva. However, these seeresses were not just a product of myth, they actually existed. Various burial sites house the remains of what's believed to be vulvas. Elderly women buried with honor, accompanied by riches, fine furs, and even staffs. There are findings of carriages, horses and animals, expensive clothing, fine jewelry, foreign objects, religious relics, and magical wands. The wand is strongly associated with seeresses and vulvas. From what is known, a vulva was typically an older woman, though she may have had followers. She would live on the outskirts of civilization, but her services would often be called upon. In particular, her ability to see into the future and predict outcomes was heavily desired. She told one of their fate to come, she told what decisions to make during times of turmoil, and she told the most beneficial times for agriculture. She told the community when to brace for the worst and when to embrace the best, in order to prepare for times less fortunate. It seems these vulvas acquired quite a bit of wealth and prestige doing so as well, judging by their graves. One of the more notable vulvas comes from the saga of Eric the Red in Greenland. Thorbjorg Little Vulva was a seeress living in Greenland during a time where food was becoming scarce. She had 9 sisters, who were all vulvas, but she was the last living one. Every winter, Thorbjorg would visit everyone's houses, with the residents welcoming her in, as she would tell of the season's harvest or their fate to come if they so desired. The saga tells us of one visit in particular, where we see just how admired these prophetesses were. A high chair is set for her with a cushion made of feathers. A feast is also prepared for her, complete with the hearts of various animals. The vulva is greeted by everyone as she enters, and is described as wearing fine clothes made from animal fur and gems. She also carries with her a staff imbued with gems and brass, as well as a bag full of talismans. She is practically treated as if she is a goddess. In order to tell the future of the farm, she claimed that she must spend the night there, have objects brought to her for the ritual, and a woman to sing the chants required. The latter of those requirements would be the only one with issue, with at first no one being capable of doing so. However, eventually, a young girl was discovered in the homestead. Having been raised in Iceland, she knew the verses. However, she tells Thorbjorg that she is unable to do so because she is Christian. The seeress encourages her to do so anyway, as it would be for the good of her people, regardless of her beliefs. The girl would comply, and the ritual would be performed with the girl's singing voice said to be so beautiful that those in attendance were in awe. Thorbjorg says the girl's song brought out the spirits required for her to prophesize, and that the hardship would soon be gone. Many spirits have been present under its charm, and were pleased to listen to the song, who before would turn away from us and grant us no such homage. And now are many things clear to me which before were hidden both from me and others. And I am able this to say, that the dearth will last no longer, the season improving as spring advances. The epidemic of fever, which has long oppressed us, will disappear quicker than we could have hoped. As thanks for her assistance, Thorbjorg tells the girl of her future, where she will meet an honorable match there in Greenland, albeit short-lived, as her future will be back in Iceland, where she will have many descendants and live a happy life. It's said that the vulva's predictions all came true. In the saga, we see the purpose and role of the Norse seeress. The wise woman encourages her people through the harshest of times, reinforcing their beliefs and their hopes. Though many of her practices would later become known as witchcraft, for the Norse people, it served to give them guidance from the gods and their priestess, in lands that were often less than forgiving. The vulva was essentially a shaman for these people. Her powers to speak with the gods and spirits of other realms, enter in a trance during the rituals. However, the use of magic was not exclusive to the village seeress. Those who practiced sorcery or magic were called Viki, basically a Viking witch. Still, as with magic in every culture, it can be used for good and evil. With the vulva, there is predominantly good intention and practice, and other types of magic existed as well, such as healing, but not all sorcery was such. Evil sorcery could include curses with a variety of effects, including illness and death. However, little historical records exist detailing such things. Regardless, the Viki and the vulva played a pivotal role in what the Christian church would later shape into the witch. The heavy use of wands and staffs used in pagan practices of heathenry would become iconic and symbolic of the practice of witchcraft. Their image of a reclusive elderly woman would become corrupted and altered from one of aid and hope into one of evil and dread. Obviously, the idea of witches and witchcraft is a fabricated one. The powers did not exist, even if their intentions did. Still, as I hoped you've learned in this video, witchcraft and sorcery is not so cut and dry. Witches with ill intent likely did exist in some form, but they are overshadowed by the travesty of those that have been falsely labeled as such. Still, with magic being a key part of practically every culture, its potential for wrongdoing was equally so. Black magic was an inevitable reality for such beliefs. It's unfortunate that such things overshadow the fact that throughout history, we see sorcery and magic being used for guidance and good intentions. Somewhere between myth and reality, between good and evil, oracles and seeresses, magicians and necromancers is the foundation of the modern witch. Twisted and mangled along the way to the image we now see, and although the world has mostly moved past such ideologies, it will always be ingrained into our history and thus should not be forgotten. Thank you for watching.